Good evening. I'm Melissa del Bosque, and it's a real pleasure to kick off the fall lecture series at the Lannan Theater. And it's an incredible honor to be part of a calendar that includes such notable speakers as Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Alice McDermott. And I want to thank the Lannan Foundation for being so incredibly supportive of independent thinkers, writers, and artists. It's great to be back in Santa Fe. My family lived here for many years, and I've spent many a night or two at a storied Santa Fe institution just up the street. Maybe y'all have heard of it. It's called Evangelos. And I also confess that I spent a night admiring the stars from the rooftop of this very theater, which I highly recommend. But seriously, I want to thank the wonderful people here at the Lannan for their hard work and commitment to maintaining this treasure for Santa Fe. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening you're in for a real treat. For the past 30 years, journalist and author Alfredo Corchado has been a witness to just about every major event that has gone down in Mexico and the border region. He's reported on 5 Mexican presidents, NAFTA, peso devaluations, the end of the PRI's perfect dictatorship, Mexico's budding democracy, and then the reemergence of the PRI in 2010. And oh yes, even the occasional Juan Gabriel concert. Much of his reporting has been for the Dallas Morning News, where he's the Mexico City bureau chief. And over the years, his writing has been crucial for U.S. readers in understanding the complexities of U.S. Mexico relations, immigration, and Mexico's struggle for democracy. But what I think is most special about Alfredo's writing is his deep understanding of Mexican culture. He doesn't just report the news, he transmits the interior lives, the hopes, the struggles of the people he's writing about. And doing so, he fosters a deeper understanding between the two distant neighbors. Alfredo can do this because he is the rarest of things in journalism, a fronterizo, a citizen of the border who easily navigates 2 countries, 2 cultures, his beloved Mexico and his adopted homeland, the United States. Born in Durango, Mexico, he moved to the U.S. when he was 7 years old. In California's San Joaquin Valley, he worked alongside his parents, who were members of the United Farm Workers Union, the union led by Cesar Chavez. Alfredo's father was a bracero, part of a generation of Mexican workers who helped transform both countries. But eventually, it was El Paso, Texas, that became home for the Corchados. Alfredo's parents opened a cafe, and for luck, they named it Freddy's after their firstborn son. Over the years, Freddy's Cafe became a popular meeting place for students, grassroots activists, politicians, and it was at Freddy's, while seating customers and bussing tables, that Alfredo honed his skills for reporting and storytelling. And what an illustrious career it has been. Alfredo's been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and a Rockefeller Fellow. In 2007, he was awarded the Maria Morris Cabot Award for his enterprise and bravery in his coverage of Mexico. And these days, unfortunately, it often takes bravery to be a reporter in Mexico. More than 70 of our Mexican colleagues have been killed just in the last decade, and Alfredo's received death threats because of his work and been forced to leave the country for periods of time. Clearly, something momentous is happening in Mexico. There's a pattern in history: the 1810 War for Independence, the Mexican Revolution of 1910, and now, at the beginning of this century, we see another kind of social upheaval. But this conflict is complicated, difficult to define. There's no clear political ideology. The biggest impulse seems to be money, greed. And as the great author Chuck Bowden, who recently passed and will be deeply missed, once wrote, there are 2 ways to lose your sanity in Juarez. One is to believe the violence results from a cartel war. The other is to claim to understand what is behind each murder. But what we do know is that since 2006, an estimated 100,000 people have been killed. At least 30,000 disappeared, and that there are refugees from this conflict living here in Santa Fe, just as there are in El Paso and other cities across the Southwest. Recently, Alfredo was telling me that he never wanted to cover narco-trafficking or drug violence. It didn't interest him. He likes to cover immigration, U.S. Mexico policy, because he wants American readers to understand the country's beauty, its culture, and its many gifts. But in recent years, too many people have died, too many disappeared. Now he feels he cannot stop writing about the violence as it consumes his homeland. In many ways, he was telling me, he feels like he's had two careers. The one before the violence, when he used to freely roam the countryside, looking for special interest stories about immigration, the environment, and other issues. And the one that began in 2003 with the rise of Los Zetas, the murders of the women of Juarez, and the massacres of the students in the Villas de Salvarcar neighborhood in Juarez. These days, as y'all know, it isn't easy to be a journalist. Journalism is undergoing its own momentous transition. Newspapers have downsized or closed, and when Alfredo started with the Dallas Morning News in the mid-90s, the Mexico City Bureau had a staff of 13 people. Now it only has one, Alfredo. In fact, he's the only Mexico correspondent for the entire state of Texas. All the other bureaus have closed in the last decade, so we're lucky to have him. And now, Alfredo is an author with a book recently released called Midnight in Mexico. This book begins with a chilling phone call, a death threat, which has become all too common to journalists in Mexico. The phone call sets Alfredo on a journey to find out the source of that threat. But on the way, we learn about Mexico's tumultuous politics, the murky relationships between politicians and drug lords, and above all else, the yearning of a native son for his homeland, and an optimism that never fades, that his country will overcome this period of darkness. Midnight in Mexico, it goes without saying, has been wildly successful and recently released in paperback. It's also been optioned by Canana Films, the film company owned by Gael Garcia Bernal and Diego Luna, to be made into a feature-length movie. So we're all betting who's going to play Alfredo, Diego or Gael? We don't know yet. So we have a running bet. So I highly recommend this book. And after the Q&A, there's going to be an opportunity to buy the book in the lobby. It's also in Spanish as well. Medianoche en México, también. So Alfredo will be there to sign books as well, so please join us after the event. And now, without further ado, Mr. Alfredo Corchado.
Buenas noches. Thank you, Melissa, for the lovely introduction. Right before we arrived, she asked me, "Are you nervous?" And I said, "I'm very nervous." And she says, "What are you nervous about? You've covered Mexico, you've covered Central America. This is Santa Fe. You should relax." But Melissa, I'm also looking forward to your book soon. And I want to thank the Lannan Foundation, Barbara, for the invitation. And my new friend, I can't really see, but Lorena Mills, somewhere here. Thank you. Y les traigo un saludo con mucho afecto desde la Ciudad de México, el DF, and El Paso, El Chuco, which we all know is more part of New Mexico than of Texas. It's indeed a privilege to be back in Santa Fe. And in fact, I'm so inspired, and I'm not sure if it's the tequila that they just gave me, but it's something happened in the last few minutes, and I'm really inspired. That I like to read just a tiny small passage from Midnight in Mexico, because I think it's the time and the date, the fact that we're all here, that I sort of thought, okay, but maybe this is the best time to read this. And this is kind of towards the end of the book. Every year we have barbecues in my home in El Paso, family gatherings, and in one, and if you buy the book, if you sort of put it close to you, you might smell the tequila. And you will hear all the music, because it took a lot of music and a lot of tequila to write this book. But the last song in the book is a song by a group called Soe from Mexico City. The song is called Luna. Luna erupted, silencio, the lyrics sweeping me away, the tide rising to the rhythm of a volcano. It was, in my opinion, a perfect afternoon. I stared into the distance, We are the same geography, one blood, two countries, dancing out of step, two souls still clashing. My feet were planted on U.S. soil. Mexico was in my sights. I did not want to be anywhere else or anyone else. At least at that moment, in my search for a home, I felt I didn't have to choose anymore. And that's exactly how I felt when I arrived yesterday in Santa Fe. I felt like, wow, el México de aquí, el México de allá. I especially want to thank Patrick Lannan for your work, your vision, social and noble causes. Tonight, I hope to serve as a bridge between our two countries, our two beloved countries. And also want to thank mi preciosa, Angela, la güerita, for making a drive from El Paso and for being here on this wonderful evening and sharing yet another memorable moment. Angela, you continue to be my light amid the darkness, and there is a lot of darkness right now. In thanking all of you, I'd like to borrow a line from then Senator Barack Obama, who once asked, in what other country, and in my case, an immigrant, the firstborn of Mexican farm workers, can stand before you on this evening and tell you my story? I'm grateful that you have asked me to talk about my book, Midnight in Mexico, and I'm especially moved to talk about such a critical issue, freedom of expression. So many journalists in my homeland of Mexico have paid the ultimate price. I hope to honor their memory. I also want to pay tribute to a friend of the foundation and a friend to many of you here, the late author Charles Bowden. Whose beautiful, evocative, powerful writing and loyalty and dedication to the border will serve as an example and an inspiration for a future generation of writers and journalists. And I know he's not here, but I also want to thank Benjamín Ali de Sáenz, who was, I think, the last speaker, for helping me in writing this book, for telling me, you got to get real here. He kept saying, you got to cut the shit and get real. Many people have asked me, what's the storyline behind Midnight in Mexico? Is it about narcos? My response is that the drug war in Mexico is just a backdrop, but the heart and soul of the story is about the universal search for home, a quest for truth. It is about believing in hope, that flickering light, that during the darkest time of the night, it's a family story, a love letter to my mother about our homeland. The tragic beauty of Mexico, a testimony to a tumultuous, transformative time. But I have to confess that moving away from that silence, that comfortable zone we reporters love so much, was the most difficult thing I have done in my career. And that's where the tequila comes in. Starting with the book proposal, and I'm sure Melissa will at some point empathize with this, but I had something like 6 to 7 failed attempts. All rejections, and they were not emails, they were actually FedEx that would come and you would open it and you go, oh my God. Enough that my agent finally calls me one day and says, Alfredo, we have a problem. He said, I have never turned my back on a client, and I have no intention of doing that to you. But this is not working out. The problem is that you're trying to be too much of a reporter and not enough of a human being. You are something of a Mexican Forrest Gump, lucky to be at the right place, the right time, but you don't have a narrative. You don't have a story. And I'm thinking, okay, this guy just wants to fire me. And he said, you may want to consider coming up to New York. So I take a plane from Mexico City, arrive in New York City, and I call up, and I think, okay, he probably has an appointment, and the secretary's going to say, it's not going to work out or something. But I talked to him, and he said, he had one final request. He says, listen, do me a favor, can you find a liquor store and pick up a bottle of your favorite tequila? And I'll see you at the office. This is Friday afternoon, around 5-ish. I'm thinking, wow. I think this is not the way I expected this to follow. Thought, okay, favorite tequila, well, that's pretty easy, Siembra Azul. I get to his office, he opens the tequila, leans back in his chair, and says, how did you first introduce yourself to me? Remind me of that. And I said, okay. I think I said something like, my name is Alfredo Corchado, and I'm the foreign correspondent for the Dallas Morning News. Though I'm not so sure I really am one. Mexico has never been foreign to me. Mexico has always been personal. Good, he responded. Now tell me your story. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to tell you just a tiny piece of that story as I take you through this personal journey. And before I do that, I just want to thank other people who are here, and that's many students I hear from high school who came and to hear the story. And at some point, I'll refer to my high school years. I had a pretty good life as a kid in Mexico. My brother Juan and I walked the streets of San Luis de Cordero, Durango, as though those dirt streets belonged to us, especially in the rain. Every day we would go to my Nina, my grandmother's house, to pick up food, caldo de res, enchiladas rojas, and if we were lucky, semitas, sweet bread. On our way back, we would stop at our friend's store, and they fill us up with more food, toys, and fruits, like higos and elotes. We played hide and seek with my uncle Delfino and my sister Lupita. Sometimes, as the sun set over the mountains, my mother would serenade us as she watered her plants. Today, people will still say that when Erlinda sang, when my mother sang, even the roosters stopped to listen. That idyllic life came to an abrupt ending on March 27, 1964. I was 4, and my sister Lupita was 2. She had been playing with her doll and dropped it in a bucket of water. See, in those days, San Luis de Cordero did not have running water or electricity. We would use pails of water to wash and cook. Lupita tossed her doll into one of those pails and then reached for it. I was supposed to be watching her. But it all happened so fast, within seconds. When my mother yelled that food was ready, I looked for Lupita, but all I could see were the soles of her shoes. Mama, Lupita won't move. She won't answer me, I yelled at her. My mother ran outside and screamed, no, no, no. She took her daughter from the pail of water and held her, screaming to the heavens above, to the gods to please not take her daughter away. But it was Holy Week, and it seemed that everyone was on holiday, including the doctors, including God. I still remember screaming at Lupita as she lay motionless in the middle of rose petals to wake up, but she wouldn't. Lupita died that day. That heartbreak led my mother to doubt whether Mexico should remain our home. For us, her sons, she wanted a new opportunity. She loved her homeland, but said Mexico was her burden, her destiny, not ours. What can we expect from a country where the laws work only for the rich, for the elite, with this elite class system and indifference to the poor, where the youth is sucked away north? So she decided we would leave Mexico and head north to join my father, a bracero, a guest worker. I left Mexico kicking and screaming. Why, I would ask, tears running down my cheeks, why would we leave our town, our beloved home of San Luis de Cordero? Our journey began in the border city of Ciudad Juarez, where we waited for our green cards, which my father, a tractor driver in California, had earned for us with his sweat. During a year-long wait for those green cards, my father sent postcards from California to inspire us. One card had a photo of the state capitol, and on the bus drive from El Paso, my 3 brothers kept asking me, as we stopped in every town, are we there yet? I would pull out that postcard and say, no, not yet, almost. So imagine our shock when our dream home turned out to be a trailer house surrounded by melon fields, rats and mice scurrying around. I was dismayed and would scream at my parents, "Que gachos son? Why did you bring us here? Why to this such ugly place?" But as a young child, what choice did I have? My body in California, my dreams back in Mexico. I joined my parents in the fields working weekends and summers. My brothers and I were encouraged to learn English, to embrace the American dream, and to put Mexico behind us in the past. See, my mother believed in reinvention. She believed that somehow borders would transform us. I remember the day after Robert F. Kennedy was killed, the senator from New York. We were working in the fields weeding out sugar beets with their long hoes. And on a radio dangling from my mother's waist, Kennedy's words would ring out in both Spanish and English with the translator. My mother would turn to us, her sons, and quiet us as we would gather around her. She would say, "Vénganse, vengan." And she would just look at us and say, "Shh." Those haunting words that I've heard then, standing in those sugar beet fields, will stay with me forever. Some men see things as they are and say, "Why?" I dream things that never were and say, "Why not?" Those simple words became her mantra and a reminder of why we come to this country. Yet somehow I managed to disappoint my parents, especially my mother. Because I am the oldest of 9, I was supposed to set the example. Instead, at the age of 15, I dropped out of high school. My mother tried everything to get me back to school. She wouldn't give up. It was the summer of '78. I was 18, and fairly certain I was in love with the girl and with the car. And I remember eating a hamburger near a Chevy dealership in Fresno. And my mother sat across me and, like always, kept nagging me about returning to school. And I argued back, "Mama, what good is an education if all the brown-skinned boys and girls I know end up working in the fields after they graduate? Besides," I said, "I'm not going back to school. I need to work the fields because I want that car." And it wasn't just any car. This was a 1978 white Camaro with a T-top. I have to admit I was a huge Batman fan. Still am. I pointed to the car spinning slowly on display, going round and round like a carousel, its red interior. Suddenly, my mother's beautiful green eyes lit up. "Well, let's make a deal," she said. "Your father and I will sign for the car, put up the down payment, and make the first 3 payments." I couldn't believe my eyes, and I almost dropped the hamburger and the fries, and I said, "Okay, go on." And she said, "But you must agree to 3 things. First, you have to promise to leave California." As Melissa said, my parents were members of the USW, and all they knew were the fields. They believed that El Paso, where we had family, was a better option. Some Hispanics there even wore ties, she said. Second, go back to school, get an education. And lastly, do not get married until you get that education. I was really intrigued, a little bit, I have to admit, I was a little also heartbroken. I was like, well, how can my mom not take the girl into account here? But my mother gave me a week to think about it. And for those 7 long, torturous, miserable weeks where I had to listen to Miguel Bosé and Juan Gabriel over and over again, I went back and forth, back and forth. Girl or car? Car or girl? What do you think I did? I picked the car. And I later left for California with the song Hotel California blaring in my brand new Camaro, headed for El Paso, Texas. My parents would check in with me daily from California to make sure that I kept my end of the deal. I did, and one day this counselor at El Paso Community College comes up to me and asks me, "Okay, so what do you want to do with your life?" And I said, "I have absolutely no idea." And he said, "Try harder." And I said, "Well, what about a hairdresser?" And he said, "That's all you got?" And I said, "Have you seen the movie Shampoo?" Warren Beatty. He shook his head and asked me to take an aptitude test. He came back and said I had a thing for foreign things like traveling abroad, languages. Maybe I should consider a career as a foreign diplomat or a foreign correspondent. He explained what that meant, reporting, being a journalist. And all I could think of was, wow, someone would actually pay me to go back to my homeland, and as a journalist. I had been intrigued by journalism since a TV crew had come to me and asked me what it was like to be in the fields. In California at that time, you had to be 15 to work a full day. I was 13. My mother tried to make me look older by wearing large clothes, a hat, anything to make me look like I belong there. But reporters, I mean, you might disagree, but I still think are too smart. And this one reporter came up to me and asked me what it was like to work without clean drinking water or sanitation or even a break. To chow down my egg burrito, I answered every question honestly and bluntly. My mother was horrified. Were we now in trouble with Cesar Chavez? And even though we had our green card, she feared that somehow, some way, the Border Patrol would deport us back to Mexico. Somehow, I hope we would. See, Mexico always reeled me back. It gave me a sense of purpose. And at the time, in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, the border felt like a laboratory for change. Across in Ciudad Juarez, Mexicans began demanding for political change, laying claim to their homeland. It felt like a social revolution. I was hooked with this incurable disease called journalism. With a diploma from the University of Texas at El Paso, I plotted my return to Mexico with Angela, my beloved fiancée and fellow journalist, and a native of DF. She loves Mexico as much as I do, and together we have covered every major story, and we have mourned and celebrated together. I left for Mexico in December of 1994 with my parents' reluctant blessing. My mother promised to pray for me daily, which she still does, and asked for protection from La Virgen de Guadalupe. But they made me promise one thing, and that's that I would never cover drug traffickers. At the time, we had the restaurant, as Melissa said, Freddy's Cafe. And one day, this man comes up to us and asks my dad, we would be interested in investing in your business. We like your wife's enchiladas, huevos rancheros, etc. And I said, well, how much are they going to put in? He said, $300,000. I thought, wow, that's great. We'll be rich. We'll have Freddy's cafes all over the U.S. Mexico border. And the guy comes back and says to my dad, you know what? Fine, we have a deal. But the cops can never find out. And if they do, we know where your kids go to school. And he listed every school that my brothers and my sisters were attending. That was a lesson that my father never forgot. My father warned me that day at the airport in El Paso, they do not know the word perdón, forgiveness. And I was fine with making that promise. After all, I had returned to Mexico to write about its possibilities, the music, the culture, the food, the tequila, the people, not about its dread, not about its defeat. Like many Mexicans, I too thought I could tapar el sol con un dedo, hide the sun, the obvious, with one finger, hide the corruption, the impunity, the weak judicial institutions, the non-existent rule of law. But as you all know so well, with Vicente Fox's 2000 election and debris out of the picture, a power vacuum grew and power shifted to states. When Felipe Calderón launched his offensive in 2007 to take control of the situation in Mexico, the violence exploded. And for me personally, that was my oh shit moment. Ironically, this was also a time when journalism began to face its own crisis. The crisis mirrored my experiences at the Dallas Morning News. As Melissa said, we downsized from 13 to 1, but the most amazing thing is that we are now the only paper, not just in Texas, but in the Southwest, other than the LA Times. Suddenly, we were faced with one of the biggest stories in Mexico, and we were short-staffed. And that story was the emergence of the Zetas paramilitary group, the criminal organization that was and is today the game changer. They changed the dynamics of organized crime. Entire communities, regions fell into their hands. This includes local mayor's offices, police departments, and newsrooms. I remember standing in front of City Hall in Nuevo Laredo and seeing these thugs with AR-15s, rocket grenade launchers, 50 caliber machine guns, and wondering who are these guys and where exactly was the government. But these criminals not just posed the biggest national security threat to Mexico, they also had ties throughout Texas, throughout the United States. In fact, their home base was Dallas. One of them, Miguel Ángel Treviño Morales, known as 40, came of age as a criminal in North Texas. I began to cover every aspect of the Zetas. How would a guy like Cuarenta, a guy whose parents also immigrated to the United States, become one of the most brutal killers in Mexico's history? He would ride around with 200 bodyguards, $40 million in cash, dominating entire states, regions of Mexico, with just the mere mention of his name or his stare. On July 2007, I got that call from the trusted U.S. source asking me, "Where are you?" And I paused for a second and just get a glass of water. Maybe I'll get that tequila instead. And I said, "In Mexico City, in La Condesa." Why do you ask? "We have information that the Zetas plan to kill an American journalist within 24 hours, and I think it's you. Get out." I felt the ground under me collapse, my legs weaken, the life in me sucked away. I felt betrayed. I had once asked this source about the likelihood that an American journalist could be targeted by a cartel. He said, "I have good news and I have bad news. The good news, a Mexican cartel does not want to harm an American journalist. It would bring too much attention to their estimated $40 billion industry. The consequences could be too messy for them. The bad news, you do not look American, carnal." See, and I say this because I am by no means more courageous or braver than my Mexican colleagues. I just want to believe that if something happens to me, someone somewhere, someone in this room here in Santa Fe will seek justice. I will not be just another number. Because as bad as the situation may sound, the danger that Angela and I face pales in comparison to what many of my Mexican colleagues confront. Mexico, as you may know, is one of the most dangerous places to practice journalism. These days, I walk in the shadow of more than 100,000 people killed or disappear in just over 7 years. Let me repeat that. 100,000 people killed or disappear in just over 7 years. Among them, dozens of Mexican colleagues who are more vulnerable and face a much more dangerous and precarious situation than I do. Drug traffickers bully reporters, harassing them if they're lucky, or silencing them for good. This evening, I speak to you in the memory of what some people say 50, 70, some organizations put the number closer to more than 100, journalists who have either been killed or disappeared since 2007. Today, there are entire regions in Mexico where reporters have elected to censor themselves. In other words, say nothing, see nothing. Recently, I was in Nuevo Laredo working on a story about energy reform. When I got there, I learned that 4 to 5 people are kidnapped daily in Nuevo Laredo, and that there are gunfights at night. That at midnight, criminals order DJs at bars to pay homage to the Zetas leaders by playing songs written for them. None of this is in the local papers, but I'm not surprised. Years ago, my colleagues in Nuevo Laredo openly said they would censor themselves for their family's safety, for their own safety. And just how bad is it for journalists? While I was there, they had just found the body of the former mayor and publisher of a local newspaper, Benjamin Galvan. To run a message of condolence, a journalist had to ask the Zetas for permission. Fear has now morphed into silence, and now it risks verging on apathy. And who can question the logic of my Mexican colleagues when the vast majority of those cases remain unsolved? Because Mexico's rule of law remains so weak, institutions virtually non-existent, crimes go unpunished. Because en el México de hoy, el México de la nueva narrativa, the country booming with economic opportunities, they still kill journalists twice. Once with a bullet, a blow to the head, or in a barrel of acid, and then they kill you again, character assassination, spreading rumors about you. Well, he was killed because he was really a spokesman for the cartels, or because he was taking drugs, or because he was sleeping with so-and-so. Because states like Tamaulipas and Veracruz, the state governed by Javier Duarte, where more than 10 journalists have been killed, including Regina Martinez, and more disappear, are some of the closest things to failed states. And even in states like Guanajuato, governed by the PAN, a reporter like Carla Silva is savagely beaten. Her aggressors warned her to stop being so bold in her criticism, which included unfavorable coverage about the rising crime rate, lack of transparency, and the local mayor in Silao. The investigation, which was just opened days ago, like all of them in Mexico, continues. Yet as bad as things are in Mexico, I remain hopeful about the future. Because in the worst moments of Mexico, I've also witnessed the best of Mexicans, and especially the best of my colleagues in Mexico and beyond. Because whether you're American or a Mexican journalist, you still believe in the power of stories, that stories can move and inspire others, that stories can still make a difference. The great journalist Bill Moyers once said, "The quality of democracy and the quality of journalism are deeply entwined." That's the goal of many of my colleagues back in Mexico. Recently, I met up with Sandra Rodriguez, a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and former journalist at the Diario de Juárez. And she asked me, "Why do you remain so optimistic?" And I said, "I'm inspired by my colleagues gradually holding politicians and the powerful accountable, shaming, not just blaming them. I am moved because in regions where narcos run the show, there are still courageous people and reporters like Javier Garza who will risk his life to tell foreign correspondents what's happening in La Laguna, coming up with guidelines on how to stay alive while practicing journalism. And I believe because there are journalists like Melissa del Bosque and Ángela Cocherga who will crisscross the border to tell stories on both sides of the border. In one instance, one massacre among many in Juárez, Angela walked around a crime scene, and it wasn't until she returned to the comfort of her home in El Paso that she realized her shoes were soaked in blood. She tossed them in the trash can. And it wasn't the shoes that mattered, but the fact that she was able to share that tragic story, reminding Americans, American viewers, of their shared responsibility for Mexico's mess. And I'm especially moved because last February marked a bright moment for Mexican journalism, following the death of a colleague in Veracruz. Journalists like Marcela Turati, Daniela Pastrana, Elia Baltazar, Veronica Calderon, Eileen Truax, and hundreds more around the world fought to share Mexico's pain with the globe. With the help of social media, they made sure that Gregorio Jimenez of Veracruz did not end up as just another number, another dead journalist. They put a name and a face and made sure that Veracruz, Mexico, and the entire world, for that matter, remember Gregorio and made sure his death was a turning point. People, particularly my mother, constantly ask me, why do I continue to live in Mexico and report on these stories? Why do I risk my life? And I have to tell you, I don't have a death wish. No story, no color is worth anyone's life. But I still believe in what Mexico can be. And maybe that sounds simplistic, maybe a bit naive, coming from someone from the border. And yet, perhaps it's precisely because I am on the border, and I know that we are the same people on both sides of the border, living on both ends, that I can still believe. Yet deep down, my mother knows there's another reason for me staying in Mexico. My stubbornness, my refusal to leave, even when all signs indicate that I should go, is nothing more than a reflection of something deeper, more intimate and personal. What is a search for home, if not a futile desire for resurrection, a renewal of a wounded spirit, a sentimental attempt to give meaning to not just one, but two lives, a reconciliation with the past? My stubbornness is really nothing more than my way of honoring my mother's strength, her courage, her anger, and her belief in me. And yes, I have to confess, to make amends for what we lost that tragic Holy Week so many, many years ago. My mother also understands that I am not complete unless I'm telling stories with one foot in two countries. Even though who I am and what I represent, the native and the outsider, is often met with as much rejection in Mexico as it is in the United States. I have spent years trying to shake the feeling that I am hopelessly American in Mexico and Mexican in America. Never fully Mexican, never fully American, often feeling less than one, sometimes more than two, depending on the moment. Yet it is in that search for a home, in the story and fusion of two worlds, that I always find the sweet spot of who we are and who I am. But I also know there's more. I tell these stories because I also believe in our responsibility, especially as journalists with more protection, to share stories so that the deaths, the human rights abuses, the disappear, and the defenseless are never forgotten, so that their plight remains fresh in our minds. I spent much of the summer telling the story of young Central Americans risking everything to reach this country. I accompanied Angela to San Pedro Sula and witnessed a country where the children had given up hope. I spent the latter part of the summer traveling the route of La Bestia, the beast, the freight train. Central Americans riding the carts, clinging to the rooftops in their effort to reach El Norte. I saw children, fear in their eyes, traveling with their mothers to unknown places, to countries that fear them and see them as terrorists or carrying some strange disease, or prey on them as though they were animals. I met one Honduran man who walked miles and seemed determined to walk all the way to the Texas border. I met a man who saw so much hatred he decided to return home to Honduras empty-handed. A Guatemalan who decided God was not enough on the perilous journey north, so he found a new companion, a 22-inch machete, and continued his journey. I saw Americans who opened their hearts and wallets and said, "Come, bring your tire, your children, and reinvent yourselves." And I witnessed those who try to slam the door and say no more. I write stories because I can, and because many of my colleagues in Mexico cannot. Because I believe in the power of stories, no matter how grim and often heartbreaking they are. When asked what is the function of a writer, one author once said, "A writer is one who, with tears in his eyes, writes about the inhumane things human beings do to each other." That may explain why many of my colleagues in Mexico and many in this room are just as traumatized as the people in the country they cover. I write because an informed society is one that can bring down walls. My first full-time job was at a small afternoon newspaper in El Paso, the El Paso Herald-Post. I have to say, even to this day, even after working for many years at the Wall Street Journal and Dallas Morning News, it was the best job ever. And we had a saying that has stuck with me throughout my career: give light, and the people will find their own way. I write stories because they do make a difference, and I'll end with one example. In the summer of 2013, when 40, the fear leader of the Zetas, was captured, it's funny, I was at a restaurant in Polanco with the Spanish editor of Midnight in Mexico, and my phone kept ringing and ringing and ringing, and I just kept ignoring it and ignoring it. And finally I thought, okay, well, this is probably important, and I went to the bathroom, and it's this guy on the phone, and he says, "Lo capturaron, they captured him." I said, "Who?" He says, "El 40. And I just, I'm not going to say what I did at that moment at the bathroom, but I was stunned. And he says, "No authority, no one has yet published or confirmed the story. You need to break the story, or he might buy his way out again, pay enough money to be free." And I have to tell you, I mulled this over for a minute or two. I came back, told the publisher, "Listen, I have to leave, breaking story, take a cab." I get in the cab, and I call him again. I said, "First of all, do you have proof?" And he said, "I just sent it to you." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I sent you the picture." And I hung up, looked at the picture. There's a picture of 40. And I'm still thinking, do I want to rile this man up? Do I want to relive all wounds? This is a guy who had put a threat on my source and later threatened the messenger, me. So I hesitated. And I started calling people. I called Angela. I said, "Listen, this has just happened. Help me out with your sources." I started calling my own sources. they all said yes, and these are sources on both sides of the border, yes, he's been captured, but no one is reporting this. I called the Mexican government. I said, listen, I'm looking for confirmation. Treviño Morales, 40, was captured. They said, we know nothing. I finally thought, you know what? If I don't write anything, if I don't report anything, this guy will be out there. I sat during a cab ride to my neighborhood of La Condesa from Polanco and calmly proceeded to write a few paragraphs on my BlackBerry and send them to my editor. Response, are you sure about this? You have over 25 years as a journalist. You have a career writing on this. You have the Mexican government saying they know nothing. I said, yes, I'm sure. It was a gut feeling. I broke the story, and the story went viral. That night, I got a tweet from one woman in Mexico who simply said, this evening, you have moved Mexico. Esta noche moviste a México. The message was clear, reinforced, and underscored. Truth still matters. Truth is our best defense. Truth is our most important protection. Truth, storytelling, is our best weapon. Thank you very much. I also want to say thank you very much. Thank you. I also want to thank you because it's very meaningful for me to be here on this night, the day after Mexico's independence. So I just want to say, after the tequila, Viva Mexico!